In the early years of World War II, the skies over Europe belonged to the Luftwaffe. The German Air Force reigned supreme, flying sleek, deadly fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190. Their pilots were veterans, confident, ruthless, and convinced that no enemy could challenge them. So when the Americans entered the war and introduced a new fighter, a big, bulky, chrome-covered beast called the P-47 Thunderbolt, the German pilots laughed. They called it names like the Flying Milk Bottle or the Jug, mocking its shape. Compared to the elegant Bf 109, the Thunderbolt looked slow and clumsy, with a wide fuselage, a huge engine, and stubby wings. Luftwaffe intelligence briefings described it as an overweight target, too heavy to dogfight, too sluggish to climb, and too fuel-hungry to pose a real threat. At first, even American pilots weren't sure what to think. Many of them preferred the sleek P-51 Mustang or the agile British Spitfire. But deep inside that massive frame, the Thunderbolt hid something terrifying, a secret that would soon wipe the smile off every German pilot's face. It began in 1943. The U.S. 8th Air Force had just started daylight bombing raids over Nazi-occupied Europe. Massive formations of B-17 flying fortresses flew deep into enemy territory and were being torn apart by German fighters. Losses were devastating. The bombers desperately needed escort fighters that could defend them, but early American planes lacked the range or the power to survive. Then came the Thunderbolt. The P-47 was powered by a monster, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine that could push out more than 2,000 horsepower. It wasn't just big, it was brutal. The plane could dive faster than anything the Germans had ever seen. When a P-47 went into a power dive, it could exceed 500 miles per hour, fast enough to tear the wings off lighter aircraft that tried to follow. But at first, the Luftwaffe didn't know that. They only saw an enormous silver plane crawling toward them from across the channel. German pilots radioed to each other, laughing. "Look at that fat one. Easy kill." In the summer of 1943, near Rouen, France, a squadron of Thunderbolts from the 56th Fighter Group made their combat debut. One of the pilots, Captain Hubert "Hub" Zemke, led his men in tight formation. High above the French countryside, a group of Messerschmitts appeared, diving in like hawks. The Germans thought they were attacking easy prey. They were wrong. Zemke ordered his men to break and dive. The Thunderbolts dropped like meteors, engines howling, their massive frames slicing through the thin air. The Germans followed, but their sleek Bf 109s began to shake violently in the dive. Control surfaces fluttered, wings strained. The P-47s, heavier and sturdier, kept going. When Zemke pulled up, he was behind the Germans. He squeezed the trigger, unleashing 8.50 caliber machine guns, each firing 13 rounds per second. A storm of lead filled the sky. One Messerschmitt disintegrated instantly. Another burst into flames. That day, the Germans stopped laughing. The Thunderbolt's power and durability stunned them. Many Luftwaffe pilots reported seeing the big American fighter take dozens of hits, cannon shells, even 20mm rounds, and keep flying. The heavy armor around its cockpit protected its pilots like a steel cage. One German ace, Heinz Bahr, reportedly told his comrades, "You cannot kill that machine. You can only make it angry." Still, the Americans had to prove themselves again and again. Every mission across France or Germany tested the limits of both pilot and machine. The Thunderbolt's massive weight made it tricky to handle at low speed, and it guzzled fuel so fast that many escorts had to turn back before the bombers reached their targets. But its pilots learned fast. They discovered that the P-47's altitude performance was unmatched. At high altitudes, 25,000 feet and above, the big turbocharger roared to life, feeding the engine compressed air and giving the Thunderbolt a deadly speed advantage. By late 1943, the P-47 had begun to earn respect. The Luftwaffe, once arrogant, started warning its new pilots, "Do not dive with the American Thunderbolt. You will not come back." One of the most famous duels happened that autumn. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, flying with the 56 Fighter Group, was returning from a mission when he was attacked by a Focke-Wulf 190. Cannon shells ripped into his plane. His canopy was jammed. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cockpit. One of his guns jammed, and another wing was nearly shredded. The German pilot circled, firing again and again, certain his enemy would go down. But Johnson's Thunderbolt refused to die. After what felt like an eternity, the FW-190 finally broke off and flew away. Johnson limped back to England, his P-47 riddled with over 200 bullet holes, yet still airborne. When he landed, his ground crew stared in disbelief. One mechanic said, "Sir, this bird shouldn't even be here." That story spread quickly, even among the Germans. From that day, they no longer mocked the P-47. They feared it. By the end of 1943, the Thunderbolt had established its reputation. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't beautiful. But it was unstoppable. Luftwaffe pilots began to dread the deep, thunderous roar of that massive engine echoing above the clouds. It meant only one thing. The Jug was coming, and with it, 8 roaring .50 calibers ready to turn their laughter into smoke. The war in the air was changing. The Thunderbolt was just beginning its rise, and soon it would become the hammer of Allied air power, the plane that would break the Luftwaffe's back. But in those first few months in 1943, the laughter still echoed over France, over Belgium, over the fields of Europe. German pilots laughed, until the moment they saw what the P-47 could really do. Before the Thunderbolt became a legend in the skies, it began as an idea, born not from glory, but from fear. In the late 1930s, the world was racing toward war. Europe was already burning. Nazi Germany's Luftwaffe was proving unstoppable, crushing Poland and France with its swift, coordinated air assaults. American military leaders watched in alarm. Their own fighters, small, lightly armed planes like the P-36 Hawk, were already obsolete. The United States needed something new, something powerful, something that could match or surpass the best the Germans had. That responsibility fell into the hands of a man named Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born engineer working for Republic Aviation in Farmingdale, New York. Kartveli was no ordinary designer. He had survived war and revolution in Europe before coming to America. He understood what real combat meant, and he was determined to give American pilots a machine that could keep them alive. But his first design, the P-35, was underpowered and lightly armed. The next, the P-43 Lancer, improved slightly, but it was still no match for the German Bf-109. Then, in 1940, Kartveli received a new directive from the U.S. Army Air Corps. Design a high-altitude interceptor capable of 400 miles per hour, armed with heavy machine guns, and capable of climbing to 30,000 feet. Kartveli read those words and smiled. "All right," he said. "Then we'll need a bigger engine." That decision would change aviation forever. He chose the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a massive 18-cylinder radial engine, one of the most powerful in existence. But there was a problem. It was so big that no existing fighter could fit around it. Kartveli didn't care. He simply built the plane around the engine. The result was something no one had ever seen before. A metal monster with a huge round nose, thick armor plating, and an enormous propeller that looked more like it belonged on a bomber than a fighter. When the first prototype, the XP-47B, rolled out of the Republic factory in 1941, even the engineers stood in silence. It looked absurd. It weighed more than twice as much as a Spitfire. Mechanics joked that it should have wheels on the wings just to taxi forward. But Kartveli knew what he had made. "It's not a dancer," he said. "It's a heavyweight champion." On May 6, 1941, the XP-47B took to the skies for its maiden flight. Test pilot Lowell Ed Bays climbed into the cockpit, surrounded by thick steel and humming machinery. The ground crew stepped back as the giant double Wasp engine coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life. Dust swirled across the airfield. The Thunderbolt's propeller spun faster and faster until it was a blur. Then, with a deep growl, the beast left the ground. What happened next stunned everyone watching. Despite its massive weight, the XP-47B climbed steadily, smoothly, and fast. At altitude, Bays opened the throttle, and the plane screamed across the sky, clocking more than 400 miles per hour. When he landed, he climbed out of the cockpit grinning. "Gentlemen," he said, "this thing is a brute, but it flies like a dream." Still, the P-47's road to perfection was not easy. The first prototypes suffered from engine overheating, control stiffness, and electrical failures. It was so large that it required special hangars and stronger runways. Ground crews called it Kartveli's headache. Yet every test flight proved one thing: the Thunderbolt could take punishment and keep flying. The Army wanted more firepower, so Kartveli added 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, the most guns ever mounted on a single-engine American fighter. Each could fire over 800 rounds per minute. Together, they unleashed a wall of lead so thick that pilots later said, "It felt like flying a shotgun the size of a house." By late 1942, production began. Workers at Republic's factory, men and women working long shifts, 7 days a week, built hundreds of Thunderbolts. Each one took nearly 6,000 man-hours to complete. Rows of gleaming silver fuselages stretched across the assembly floor, engines waiting to roar. The U.S. was preparing for something massive: air superiority over Europe. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, the British Royal Air Force received a few of the first Thunderbolts for testing. Their initial reactions echoed the Germans: too heavy, too slow. But then came the combat reports. Pilots discovered that the P-47 could dive faster than any plane they'd ever flown. In one test, it reached an unheard-of speed of 725 miles per hour in a power dive and came out intact. No other fighter survived that. Word began to spread. The beast was real. While the Thunderbolt's design was revolutionary, its technology was equally impressive. It carried a General Electric turbosupercharger, a complex system of ducts and turbines that forced compressed air into the engine at high altitude. This allowed the P-47 to perform flawlessly even at 30,000 feet, where other fighters gasped for air. The long ductwork that fed the turbo gave the plane its distinctive, bulbous belly, another reason for the Jug nickname. Every inch of the aircraft was engineered for survival. The cockpit was surrounded by thick armor plating. Fuel tanks were self-sealing. Control cables were doubled for redundancy. Even the landing gear was overbuilt, capable of absorbing hard impacts from inexperienced pilots. The Thunderbolt wasn't just designed to fight. It was designed to come home. By early 1943, squadrons of P-47s began arriving in England. The American pilots who saw them for the first time couldn't believe their size. One mechanic reportedly said, "This ain't a fighter, it's a flying battleship." But when they took off, climbed into the cold English sky, and felt the raw force of that double Wasp engine, their doubts began to fade. In those first few weeks, they learned to trust the machine. The Thunderbolt's immense power made it stable in dives, forgiving in battle, and surprisingly agile once you mastered its weight. It wasn't meant to twist and turn like a Spitfire. It was built to hit hard, take punishment, and outlast the enemy. Alexander Kartvel's vision had come to life. The beast had taken shape, forged from American steel, powered by raw fire, and guided by the hands of pilots who would soon write history with it. The laughter of the skeptics was fading now, replaced by awe. The Republic factory was running day and night, producing a machine that would soon roar across Europe's skies like thunder. And though few realized it at the time, the arrival of the P-47 marked a turning point in the air war. It was no longer just about speed or maneuverability. It was about power, endurance, and survival. It was about building a fighter that could outlast the storm. The beast had arrived, and the sky would never be the same again. In the spring of 1943, the moment finally came. The P-47 Thunderbolt, that massive, misunderstood machine, was about to face its first true test. No more mock dogfights, no more test runs over Long Island or the English countryside. This time, it would meet the Luftwaffe in real combat over the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. The U.S. Army Air Forces had formed a new unit, the 56th Fighter Group, based at Halesworth, England. Its commander, Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, was a seasoned pilot, calm, analytical, and fiercely protective of his men. He had flown Spitfires alongside the British and knew exactly what the Luftwaffe could do. When he first saw the P-47, he wasn't sure what to think. It was huge, heavy, and unfamiliar. But Zemke understood one thing immediately: the plane had potential. He spent weeks training his pilots to master the Thunderbolt's quirks. The long takeoff roll, the slow climb, the brutal torque from its massive propeller. Many young aviators cursed the machine at first, but Zemke taught them to fight with its strengths. Its speed in a dive, its ruggedness, and its devastating firepower. He told them, "You don't turn with a German. You dive, strike, and climb. You fight like thunder, fast and final." Their first mission came on April 8, 1943. The target was Rouen, France. The objective: to escort bombers attacking German industrial sites. For most of these young men, it was their first flight over enemy territory. Engines roared to life before dawn, filling the airfield with a low, thunderous hum. The sky was cold and gray. The smell of oil and exhaust mixed with tension and fear. As the Thunderbolts lifted off, the British ground crews watched them disappear into the clouds. Those enormous silver birds heading toward the unknown. At 20,000 feet, the formation crossed the French coast. The radio crackled with reports from the bomber crews ahead. Then came the words every fighter pilot both dreaded and lived for: "Bandits 11 o'clock high." A formation of Messerschmitt Bf 109s was approaching fast. The Germans dove from above, sunlight glinting off their wings. They were confident they had faced every Allied fighter before and won. To them, this new American plane looked slow and fat, an easy kill. But as the first German fired and broke away, the P-47s showed their teeth. Zemke shouted into the radio, "Brake! Dive! Hit 'em hard!" The sky erupted. Tracers and contrails slashed across the blue. One P-47 dropped into a screaming dive, its massive engine howling. A Bf 109 tried to follow, but within seconds, the Germans' wings began to flutter. The Thunderbolt pulled out easily, now behind its pursuer. The pilot squeezed the trigger and 8.50 caliber guns answered. The Messerschmitt disintegrated in midair. That was the first confirmed kill for the P-47 Thunderbolt in World War II. For the next 20 minutes, the fight raged in and out of clouds. The Thunderbolts dived, fired, and climbed back into the sun. Zemke's men quickly realized something incredible. No matter how hard the Germans tried, they couldn't break the P-47's spirit. It could take hits that would shred a Spitfire and still fly. One pilot returned to base with a foot-long hole in his wing and oil leaking from the engine, yet landed safely. When the mission ended, the group had lost 2 planes, but they had destroyed several German fighters and, more importantly, proven that the Thunderbolt could fight. The laughter of the Luftwaffe was fading. In the following weeks, the 56 Fighter Group continued flying deep escort missions to Lille, Antwerp, and Paris. Each battle taught them something new. They learned to climb higher than the Germans, to use their superior dive speed, to hit once and vanish. By the summer of 1943, the Thunderbolt was earning its reputation as a fearsome opponent. But the real baptism came on August 17, 1943, the day of the Regensburg-Schweinfurt raid. It was one of the largest bombing missions of the war. Hundreds of American bombers striking deep inside Germany, hitting aircraft factories and ball-bearing plants. The Thunderbolts were assigned to escort them, as far as their limited fuel would allow. As the bombers crossed the Rhine, swarms of German fighters rose to meet them. The sky over central Germany turned into chaos. Black smoke from flak bursts filled the air. Dozens of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs dived straight into the bomber formations, cannons blazing. Zemke's Thunderbolts met them head-on. For hours, the battles raged at altitudes above 25,000 feet. The P-47s tore through enemy formations, their 8 guns cutting across the sky like lightning. Pilots reported seeing German aircraft explode so violently that debris struck their own planes. One pilot, Lieutenant Walker Bud Mahurin, described the scene later. It was like fighting inside a storm. Everywhere you looked, flashes, smoke, and pieces of airplanes falling. You didn't think. You just reacted. But the price was high. Several Thunderbolts ran out of fuel before reaching the channel and had to bail out. Others returned with engines shot up and wings riddled with holes. Yet despite the losses, the bombers made it home. The Luftwaffe had been forced to fight on the Americans' terms, and it had paid dearly. That day cemented the Thunderbolt's place in history. The German High Command began issuing new orders to its fighter wings. Do not engage the large American fighter in a dive. They called it the brick with wings. But now the nickname carried fear, not mockery. The baptism of fire was complete. By late 1943, the once clumsy Jug had transformed into a nightmare for the Luftwaffe. Pilots who had doubted it now swore by it. They painted names on their fuselages: Topsy, Misfire, Lucky Lady. They personalized their armor, knowing that each mission could be their last. Yet they flew with growing confidence, trusting the beast that had saved so many lives. From England to France to the heart of Germany, the P-47 became a symbol of unstoppable momentum. It was no longer just a fighter, it was the embodiment of American resilience and engineering power. The men who flew it would go on to score hundreds of kills, but none would ever forget that first day, April 8, 1943, when the Thunderbolt first drew blood and proved itself worthy of its name. It entered the war amid laughter and doubt. It emerged from its baptism of fire as a legend. And for the Luftwaffe pilots who once mocked it, that day marked the beginning of a new fear, the fear of the Jug, the fear of thunder. By 1943, the American air war over Europe had reached a boiling point. Day after day, waves of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators thundered across the English Channel, massive, shining formations carrying thousands of pounds of bombs. Their target, the factories, airfields, and railways that kept Hitler's war machine alive. But the price was terrible. German fighters, sleek Messerschmitts and deadly Focke-Wulfs, tore into the bomber streams like wolves attacking a herd. Entire squadrons were wiped from the sky. American gunners fought back bravely, but it wasn't enough. The bombers needed a protector, something that could meet the Luftwaffe head-on. That protector arrived in the form of a silver beast armed with 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns. The P-47 Thunderbolt. Each of those guns could fire more than 800 rounds per minute. Together, they unleashed over 160 rounds of lead every second, enough to cut through steel, shatter engines, and tear wings clean off enemy aircraft. It wasn't just a fighter anymore. It was a flying storm. When the Germans first encountered the P-47 in combat, they were unprepared for its sheer firepower. Luftwaffe pilots were used to facing Spitfires or Mustangs, nimble opponents who fought elegant dogfights. The Thunderbolt fought differently. It didn't dance. It roared. It attacked from above, unleashed a wall of bullets, and left only smoke behind. One of the first to discover its devastating power was Lieutenant Frank Klibb of the 56th Fighter Group, the famed Zemke's Wolfpack. On a cold morning in October 1943, his squadron intercepted a formation of German FW-190s over the Netherlands. Klibb dived through the clouds at 25,000 feet, lining up on an enemy fighter below. He squeezed the trigger. The 8 Brownings came alive with a deafening, rhythmic roar. Tracers streaked through the air like burning comets. In less than 2 seconds, his target exploded into a ball of flame. The shockwave rocked Klibb's plane, but the P-47 held steady. He radioed back, voice shaking with adrenaline. "Good God, I just erased him." From that day, the 56th Fighter Group earned its fearsome reputation, and the Luftwaffe began to call the Thunderbolt der Amerikanische Hammer, the American Hammer. What made those guns so deadly wasn't just their number, but how they were used. Mounted in the wings, the Brownings were carefully angled to converge their fire at about 300 yards, the perfect range for tearing a fighter apart. When a P-47 pilot pulled the trigger, the streams of bullets met at a single point in space, concentrating destructive force like a laser beam. Each bullet was a .50 caliber armor-piercing round, heavy enough to punch through the fuselage of a Bf-109 or even the engine block of a Focke-Wulf. When mixed with incendiary rounds, they ignited fuel tanks, ammunition belts, or anything flammable. A 1-second burst could deliver nearly 60 pounds of lead and fire into a target. The Germans quickly learned to fear that sound, the deep, rumbling thunder of 8 Brownings echoing through the clouds. Many Luftwaffe pilots reported feeling panic when they heard it behind them. One ace, Erich Rudorfer, admitted, "When the Thunderbolt fired, it was like the sky itself was falling apart." For American pilots, those guns became their best friend. The Thunderbolt was fast, tough, and heavy, but its true soul lay in those 8 barrels. Pilots learned to use them not only against aircraft but against anything that moved. As the Allies advanced into France, the P-47s began flying low-level ground attack missions. Their targets weren't just planes anymore, they were tanks, trains, trucks, and convoys. The Thunderbolt could dive at 400 miles per hour, level out just above the treetops, and unleash a blizzard of .50 caliber rounds. Entire German columns were left burning, twisted, and broken. One pilot, Captain Walker Bud Mahurin, described it perfectly. "You didn't need bombs. 850s could turn a Panzer into scrap metal before it even fired a shot." Film footage from that era shows P-47 strafing rail yards, ammunition depots, and airfields, their gunfire ripping through lines of locomotives and parked aircraft. The Germans tried to camouflage their vehicles, but it didn't matter. The Jugs pilots hunted them relentlessly. The P-47's guns were also remarkably reliable. They rarely jammed even after thousands of rounds. Engineers designed the wings with wide maintenance panels so ground crews could easily reload and service the guns between missions. Crews worked in freezing rain and mud, loading belts of ammunition that stretched over 27 feet long for each side. The pilots called them belts of thunder. And yet, the power of the Thunderbolt came at a cost. The guns consumed ammunition fast, Just 30 seconds of total firing time before the wings ran dry. Pilots had to learn discipline. Many veterans would tell new recruits, "Don't spray. Wait until you see him. One clean burst. That's all you'll ever need." They were right. One of the most famous examples came from Lieutenant Francis "Gabby" Gabreski, one of the top American aces of the war. On a mission in early 1944, Gabreski spotted a formation of FW-190s below. He dove silently from above, his Thunderbolt howling through the thin air. At 400 yards, he lined up his sights and fired a single burst 2 seconds long. Both enemy fighters disintegrated before they even knew he was there. Gabreski climbed away untouched. His squadron counted the kills. 2 bursts, 2 planes. No misses. Stories like that spread through every airbase in England. The P-47's reputation grew with each mission. It wasn't just a fighter. It was a symbol of overwhelming American firepower and engineering precision. By late 1944, Luftwaffe pilots had learned a grim rule. If a Thunderbolt got behind you, you didn't try to outturn it. You dove, you ran, or you prayed. Because when those 8 Brownings spoke, the sky turned into hell. The legacy of the Thunderbolt's guns went far beyond the war itself. After the victory in Europe, captured German engineers admitted they had never faced anything like it. Even hardened veterans confessed that their planes couldn't withstand such punishment. The P-47's 8 guns changed the way fighter design was viewed forever, proving that raw, concentrated firepower could dominate the skies as much as speed or agility. For the men who flew it, the Thunderbolt wasn't just a machine, it was their shield and sword. They trusted it with their lives. They joked that its guns were like the voice of God, deep, relentless, and final. And when those 8.50s opened fire, everyone, friend or foe, knew exactly what it meant. The jug was here, and nothing in the sky could stand against it. By the spring of 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had found its destiny. It was no longer just a high-altitude escort fighter. It had become something much more fearsome. Across the skies of Europe, American pilots began using the jug for a new and brutal purpose, destroying everything that moved on the ground. The shift came out of necessity. When the longer-ranged P-51 Mustangs began escorting bombers deep into Germany, many Thunderbolt groups were reassigned to low-level missions. Some pilots grumbled. Others welcomed the change. But no one truly understood what the P-47 could do, not yet. The first hint came during missions over northern France. Pilots were ordered to attack German convoys, supply trains, and anti-aircraft positions in preparation for the coming invasion of Normandy. The Thunderbolt, built like a tank, could dive at incredible speed without tearing apart. It carried 10.50 caliber machine guns, bombs, and even rockets. It was quite literally flying artillery. One pilot, Captain Robert S. Johnson, recalled his first ground attack run. You looked down and saw those convoys stretching for miles, trucks, tanks, half-tracks, all crawling like ants. Then you rolled over, lined up the gun sight, and pulled the trigger. The world just exploded below you. The 8.50 cal guns unleashed a storm of bullets, nearly 100 rounds per second, shredding anything soft, thin, or unlucky enough to be on a road that day. German soldiers would dive into ditches as their vehicles burned. Locomotives erupted in steam and fire as the jugs strafed rail lines from end to end. It was devastating. The Luftwaffe could no longer protect its supply lines, and the German army began to fear the roar of radial engines. When soldiers heard the distant growl of a P-47, they didn't look up to see what model it was. They simply ran for cover. By June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Thunderbolt had become a symbol of Allied dominance. From dawn to dusk, jugs patrolled the beaches and the roads behind them, striking anything that moved. Bridges, fuel trucks, artillery batteries, all were prime targets. One squadron alone destroyed over 80 vehicles in a single day. Pilots flew as many as 4 missions before sunset, returning to base only long enough to refuel, rearm, and grab a bite of cold rations. The ground crews worked without rest, patching bullet holes and loading belts of ammunition that seemed endless. And the pilots kept flying, through smoke, flak, and exhaustion. Many of them said the same thing: "You don't think, you just react. You aim for movement and squeeze the trigger." In the days after D-Day, the skies above Normandy were thick with smoke and chaos. The Thunderbolt became the juggernaut of the Allied advance. It destroyed tanks, cut off German reinforcements, and harassed retreating forces. One of its most effective weapons was the 5-inch high-velocity rocket, capable of punching through the armor of even the feared panzer divisions. When the Allies pushed deeper into France, the P-47's range was extended using belly tanks. Pilots would fly from temporary forward airstrips, often just dirt runways behind the front lines. They lived rough, sleeping in tents, eating from ration tins, and flying until their hands were blistered from gripping the controls. But the results were undeniable. The Thunderbolt had become a hammer, and the German army was the anvil. In August 1944, during the breakout from Normandy, Thunderbolts were unleashed against the trapped German forces in the Falaise pocket. It was a massacre. Columns of vehicles tried to escape through narrow roads, but the P-47s circled overhead like vultures. They dove in pairs, firing guns, dropping bombs, and launching rockets into the massive tanks and trucks below. By the time it was over, hundreds of vehicles lay burning. German survivors later called it the Day of the Jabos, the Day of the Fighter Bombers. General Dwight D. Eisenhower would later say, "The P-47s and Typhoons did more to destroy German armor and transport than any other weapon on the battlefield." Even the German generals took notice. One captured officer reportedly told his American interrogator, "We feared your Thunderbolts more than your tanks." That was no exaggeration. The Thunderbolt's durability meant it could take hits that would destroy any other aircraft. Pilots often returned with flak holes big enough to fit a fist through. Some came home missing cylinders, with engines running rough but still alive. The Jug's radial engine and rugged frame were its shield, a flying fortress in its own right. Among the many heroes of this era was Lieutenant Colonel Francis "Gabby" Gabreski, who led his squadron with unmatched skill and aggression. He became the top American ace in the European theater, scoring 28 victories, many in air-to-air combat, but countless more in strafing runs that destroyed enemy columns. He famously said, "You didn't need to see the whites of their eyes, just the dust on the road. That was enough." Under leaders like Gabreski, Zemke, and Mahurin, the Thunderbolt community built a reputation for relentless precision. Their tactics evolved into something close to art: high-speed dives, skip-bombing techniques, rocket salvos followed by gun strafes. Each mission was choreographed chaos. By late 1944, the German front was collapsing. The P-47 squadrons, now operating from France and Belgium, struck deeper and deeper into enemy territory. They hit rail yards, bridges, and retreating convoys. On Christmas Eve 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, the weather finally cleared, and the Thunderbolts took to the sky in force. They smashed German supply lines and halted armored advances, tipping the balance of the battle in the Allies' favor. It was said that when the snow fell silent after the attacks, the roads were littered with twisted steel, and among the wreckage, a strange quiet followed. The thunder had passed, but its echo remained. By early 1945, the Thunderbolt's legend was secure. It had destroyed over 86,000 ground targets, tanks, trains, trucks, and artillery, more than any other Allied aircraft. Its pilots had turned a machine once mocked for its size into the king of ground attack, a flying sledgehammer that broke the backbone of Nazi logistics. As the war neared its end, even the pilots themselves seemed humbled by what they had witnessed. They had seen the destruction from above, cities burning, columns shattered, the landscape torn apart. But they knew it was the cost of victory. One pilot, reflecting years later, said quietly, "When you flew a P-47, you didn't feel like a hero. You felt like a weapon. But it was a weapon the world needed." And so the Jug carried on, its roar echoing across France, the Low Countries, and into the heart of Germany. Every time it dove, it brought thunder. Every time it climbed back into the clouds, it left behind only smoke and silence. The P-47 Thunderbolt had entered the war as a misunderstood brute. Now it reigned as king of ground attack, the thunder that shattered the Reich. By late 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had already earned its place in the skies, a warrior forged from steel, fire, and courage. But war is never still. As the front lines moved deeper into Europe and across the vast Pacific, the Thunderbolt itself began to change. The Jug evolved faster, stronger, and deadlier than ever before. The early versions, the P-47B and C, had proven their worth in dogfights and escort missions. But they also had limits: short range, heavy fuel consumption, and a slow climb rate at altitude. For bomber escorts pushing deep into Germany, those limits could mean life or death. So Republic Aviation and the U.S. Army Air Forces demanded more range, more power, more thunder. The birth of the D-Series. In 1943, Republic engineers began work on what would become the most famous version of the plane, the P-47D. Externally, it didn't look much different, but inside, it was a completely new beast. The D-Series introduced a bubble canopy, giving pilots 360-degree visibility, a critical upgrade in dogfights. No longer trapped behind steel frames, they could finally see the sky around them, spot enemies earlier, and survive longer. The D also came with an improved R2800-59 engine, equipped with water injection that boosted horsepower to over 2,300 horsepower. In a dive, it could now exceed 500 miles per hour, making it one of the fastest propeller-driven aircraft in the world. And perhaps most importantly, it could carry more fuel. With new drop tanks slung under its wings and belly, the P-47's combat range expanded from 200 miles to nearly 600. That meant bomber formations could finally be escorted deeper into German territory, through skies once dominated by the Luftwaffe. It was a turning point. When German pilots saw the P-47s over central Germany, far from the English Channel, they knew something had changed. The Thunderbolt was no longer just a coastal guardian. It had become a hunter, the long arm of thunder. By 1944, the Thunderbolt's missions extended beyond bomber escort. It became a true multi-role fighter, capable of high-altitude interception, close air support, and even reconnaissance. Pilots began pushing the aircraft to its limits. They mounted larger bombs, up to 2,500 pounds, and fired rocket salvos that could destroy armored trains and bridges. One airman joked, "If it fits under a jug, it flies with a jug." The 56th, 78th, and 362nd Fighter Groups led the charge, pioneering new tactics. They would dive from altitude like falling meteors, drop bombs, or unleash rockets, then pull up through the smoke, all while firing their 8.50 caliber guns. This evolution turned the P-47 into one of the most flexible and feared aircraft in the Allied arsenal. It could fight air battles one day, and the next tear up a rail yard or fuel depot. And despite all this weight, it still danced through the air like a prizefighter, crossing oceans. But as Europe inched toward liberation, another war raged across the Pacific, a different kind of battlefield, where distances were measured in oceans, not miles. The Thunderbolt's range, once its biggest weakness, would again be tested. To meet the challenge, Republic developed a final, magnificent evolution, the P-47N. The N was built for endurance. It featured longer wings with squared tips, extra internal fuel tanks, and a powerful R-2800-77 engine. Its range now stretched to 2,000 miles, enough to fly from island to island across the Pacific. These new Thunderbolts joined the fight in early 1945, escorting B-29 superfortresses on raids against Japan. For the first time, the roar of the Thunderbolt echoed above the Pacific Islands, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, places where airfields were carved from coral and volcanic rock. The conditions were brutal. Tropical heat warped metal, saltwater corroded engines, and long missions pushed pilots to exhaustion. But the P-47N thrived, could stay in the air for 8 hours, fight, and still make it home. Over Japan, it hunted down Kawasaki Ki-84s and Nakajima Ki-43 Oscars, matching them in speed and crushing them with superior firepower. When Japanese anti-aircraft guns opened up, the Jug shrugged off hits and kept coming, just as it had in Europe. Engineering evolution. Behind every improvement was a team of relentless engineers at Republic Aviation. They experimented with propeller designs, engine cooling systems, and even automatic dive recovery features, early technology that prevented pilots from blacking out during high-speed dives. They also refined the controls, making the big machines surprisingly agile. Many new pilots were shocked by how responsive it felt, despite its size. One said, "It looked like a truck, but flew like a falcon." By 1945, the Thunderbolt had become a masterpiece of wartime innovation, a culmination of every lesson learned from years of aerial combat. Its final forms represented not just progress in metal and horsepower, but the evolution of survival itself. The plane had been born from doubt, refined by combat, and perfected by necessity. The ultimate Jug. As the war neared its end, the P-47 was everywhere. Over the beaches of Normandy, in the skies above Berlin, over the jungles of Burma, and across the Pacific Islands. It had become the backbone of Allied fighter power. When the atomic bomb ended the war, Thunderbolts were already stationed on Okinawa, ready to lead the invasion of Japan, an invasion that, thankfully, never came. By then, over 15,600 Thunderbolts had been built, more than any other U.S. fighter in history. They had flown more than 746,000 combat sorties, destroyed over 86,000 ground targets, and shot down 3,752 enemy aircraft. It was a legacy written in smoke and courage, and the result of constant evolution. The Thunder rolls on. After the war, newer jet fighters began to take the stage, sleek silver machines powered by turbine engines instead of pistons. But for many pilots, nothing ever felt quite like the Jug. In Korea, some Thunderbolts continued to serve in ground attack roles. Others were sold to foreign air forces. France, Italy, Brazil, and even the Philippines, where they flew for years, still roaring with that deep, unmistakable sound of thunder. Each variant, from the early Razorbacks to the long-winged Pacific models, told a story of adaptation. Proof that in war, survival belongs not to the strongest or the fastest, but to those who can evolve. The P-47 began as a misunderstood giant, too heavy, too slow, too strange. But it ended as one of the greatest aircraft of the 20th century. A machine that combined brute strength, elegant engineering, and relentless endurance. Its evolution mirrored that of the men who flew it, learning, adapting, and rising to every challenge. Even now, when the last surviving Jugs rumble to life at airshows, their engines echo the legacy of that transformation. Each cylinder fires like a heartbeat from another time, a reminder of how thunder once ruled the sky. From the cold airfields of England to the sun-bleached runways of the Pacific, one truth remained the same. The Thunderbolt was never just a plane. It was a living, evolving force of nature, and when it roared, the world listened. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world exhaled, but the roar of the Thunderbolt did not fade. For years, the sky had trembled with its deep radial growl. Now, in peace, that sound became something else. A memory of power, courage, and survival. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the Jug, had done what few machines ever achieve. It had not only won battles, it had earned immortality. A veteran's farewell. In airfields across England, France, and the Pacific, lines of Thunderbolts stood silent in the grass. Some were worn, oil-streaked, and riddled with bullet holes. Others still gleamed under the sun, ready for missions that would never come. Pilots who had survived hundreds of sorties walked among them, touching their wings like old friends. They remembered the sound, that thunderous rumble at takeoff, the way the cockpit shook as 8 Browning guns roared together, the feeling of safety inside all that armor. For many of these men, the Jug wasn't just an airplane. It was a lifeline. Captain Francis "Gabby" Gabreski, America's top P-47 ace, once said, "The Jug brought me home when nothing else could. I trusted it with my life, and it never let me down." From warbird to workhorse. After the war, new jet fighters like the P-80 Shooting Star and the F-86 Sabre began to take center stage. The era of the propeller was ending, but the Jug still had work to do. Hundreds of Thunderbolts were shipped to allied nations rebuilding their air forces. France, Italy, Brazil, Mexico, and the Philippines all received squadrons of the powerful fighter. In Brazil, the P-47s continued to serve for nearly a decade. Pilots trained on them, flew parades, and patrolled borders. In Latin America, the Jug became a symbol of strength, a living reminder of the war that had reshaped the world. Meanwhile, in the United States, some P-47s found new life in the National Guard. They were used for training, ground attack, and even test flights for new weapons. The aircraft's rugged design made it a perfect platform for experimentation. Engineers tested jet-assisted takeoff rockets, radar pods, and new types of bombs. The Jug kept evolving even in peacetime. The thunder across the Pacific. In Asia, the P-47's reputation only grew. The Philippine Air Force flew Thunderbolts into the 1950s, using them to defend the islands during times of unrest. Their deep rumble over Manila became part of the soundscape of independence. Even after the Korean War began in 1950, a few Jugs saw limited service in ground attack roles before being replaced by faster jets. But those who flew them said nothing else felt quite the same. The pilots of the new jet age respected the power of the Thunderbolt, the way it could take hits, dive through flak, and still bring its pilot home. Many modern attack aircraft, from the A-10 Thunderbolt II to the F-15 E-Strike Eagle, trace their philosophy back to the Jug: survivability, firepower, and mission focus over beauty or speed. The name itself, Thunderbolt II, was no coincidence. When the U.S. Air Force named its new close air support jet in 1977, they chose the title to honor the original, the plane that had made thunder a weapon. Engineering lessons. From an engineering standpoint, the P-47 was ahead of its time. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double WASP engine became the foundation for later aircraft designs. The turbo-supercharger system, which allowed it to perform at high altitude, directly influenced post-war jet research. Republic aviation engineers who had worked on the Jug later contributed to the design of jet fighters such as the F-84 Thunderjet and the F-105 Thunderchief, continuing the bloodline of Thunder into the supersonic era. The concept of a multi-role fighter, capable of both air combat and ground attack, started with the Thunderbolt. That idea became standard for all modern fighters, from the F-4 Phantom to today's F-35 Lightning II. Every time a modern aircraft takes off with a mix of bombs and missiles, it carries a bit of the Jug's DNA. Legends of the sky. But perhaps the greatest legacy wasn't mechanical. It was human. The P-47 turned ordinary men into legends. Pilots like Robert Johnson, who returned to base with more than 200 bullet holes in his plane, Hub Zemke, the fearless leader of the 56 Fighter Group, and Neil Kirby, who downed 6 enemy aircraft in a single mission and earned the Medal of Honor. Their stories became part of aviation folklore, tales of courage told in flight schools and veterans' reunions for generations. One veteran remembered, "When you were in a Jug, you felt untouchable. You could hear the bullets hit, you could smell the oil, but the engine just kept roaring. It was like flying a piece of America itself, a symbol of the Allied spirit." The Thunderbolt's legacy also lives in what it represented. It wasn't sleek like a Spitfire or elegant like a Mustang. It was brute force, raw determination, and overwhelming firepower. It embodied the industrial might of the United States. Big, loud, and unstoppable. To the soldiers on the ground, it was salvation. To the enemy, it was terror. To the pilots, it was home. In post-war Europe, children who had once hidden from the roar of its guns later lined up to see them in air shows, pointing at the planes that had helped free their countries. The Jug had gone from symbol of destruction to symbol of liberation, restorations, and remembrance. Today, only a handful of Thunderbolts still fly. Each one is a masterpiece of restoration, rebuilt piece by piece from the skeletons found in barns, jungles, and forgotten hangars. When one of them takes off at an air show, the crowd feels the same vibration through the ground that soldiers once felt on the front lines. The radial engine rumbles, the propeller bites the air, and that unmistakable sound, deep, thunderous, proud, fills the sky again. In that moment, time folds. The ghosts of 1944 return, and the laughter, the fear, the victory, all of it lives again in the roar of a single machine. The legacy that never fades. More than 15,600 Thunderbolts were built, more than any other U.S. fighter of World War II. But numbers alone can't measure its impact. Its true legacy lies in what it taught: that strength, protection, and firepower could coexist with agility and precision. That a machine once mocked for its weight could become the most trusted ally a pilot ever had. Even now, 8 decades later, historians, engineers, and veterans still call it by the same name. Not P-47, not Republic's fighter, but simply the Jug. It's a name spoken with affection, reverence, and a touch of awe, because the Thunderbolt was more than metal and rivets. It was the sound of victory, the heart of a generation, and the bridge between 2 eras, the age of propellers and the dawn of the jet. And as long as thunder still rolls across the skies, the legacy of the Jug will never die. By the time 1944 turned to 1945, the P-47 Thunderbolt had earned a reputation not just as a powerful fighter, but as a survivor. It was the aircraft that refused to die. While other fighters limped home with thin margins of luck, the Thunderbolt seemed almost immortal. The Germans had their sleek Messerschmitts and deadly Focke-Wulfs. The British had their agile Spitfires. But the Americans had something else. A machine so tough that its pilots joked it could fly through a brick wall and ask for more fuel. At the heart of this legend was its engine. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial beast that could take astonishing punishment. Unlike inline engines, which depended on coolant systems vulnerable to a single bullet, the radial engine of the P-47 could be shot full of holes and still run. Pilots soon discovered that what others called damage, the Jug called Tuesday. One of the most famous stories came from Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 56 Fighter Group, the same man who had once doubted the Thunderbolt's size. On June 26, 1943, Johnson's P-47 was riddled with cannon shells from a German FW-190 over northern France. His canopy jammed shut, his fuel tank caught fire, and hydraulic fluid sprayed across his cockpit. He should have been dead, but the jug held together. Johnson pulled out of the dive, flames licking the fuselage, and tried desperately to open the canopy. It wouldn't budge. Moments later, the German ace Egbert von Kant appeared behind him and opened fire. Cannon shells smashed into Johnson's tail, wings, and fuselage. Yet the Thunderbolt simply would not fall. When the German ran out of ammunition and peeled away, Johnson's aircraft, shot over 200 times, was still flying. Somehow the engine kept turning, the wings stayed on, and the pilot was alive. He finally managed to land back in England, where ground crews counted 21 holes in the fuselage, 4 in the propeller and several in the cockpit armor. It became one of the most famous survival stories of the war. From that day on, Johnson said, "I'll take the jug over any plane in the world." There were many more like him. Captain Darrell D. Welch once returned from a mission over Belgium with half a wing missing. A German flak burst had torn through the right side of his aircraft, ripping away panels and puncturing the oil cooler. But the massive P-47 still glided home, coughing and smoking, landing safely on a grass strip that barely counted as a runway. Another pilot, Lieutenant Elmer "Bub" Taylor, was hit so hard that half of his tail section was gone. He couldn't believe it was still controllable. "She flew crooked," he later said. But she flew. Even the enemy took notice. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from late 1944 described the Thunderbolt as extremely resistant to damage and hard to destroy even with direct hits. Much of this resilience came from the way the Thunderbolt was built. Its airframe was over-engineered, its armor thick and distributed intelligently around the cockpit and fuel system. The P-47 carried more than half a ton of armor plating, protecting the pilot from almost every direction. The fuselage itself acted like a shield. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, and the control systems were often doubled, meaning that if one line was cut, the other could still function. The result? Even when riddled with bullets, the jug often limped back to base. Ground crews used to joke that you didn't fix a Thunderbolt, you just patched it and sent it back out. They would work overnight, welding holes, bolting new panels, wiping off oil streaks. And every morning, the same machine would roar to life again, climbing into the gray English skies like nothing had happened. In early 1945, during the Battle of the Bulge, one squadron of P-47s flew non-stop ground attack missions despite freezing weather and constant flak. The Germans threw everything they had, 88mm guns, machine guns, even small arms, at the low-flying jugs. Many came back with holes big enough to see daylight through the fuselage. Yet the loss rate remained remarkably low. Colonel Hub Zemke, the legendary commander of the 56th Fighter Group, said it best. The Thunderbolt could absorb punishment that would tear other fighters apart. You could bring one home on a prayer, and most times the prayer was answered. He once inspected a returning aircraft that had landed with its landing gear gone, one wing shredded, and the tail almost severed. The pilot had simply belly landed in a field, climbed out, and lit a cigarette. The jug was wrecked, but it had saved another life. The P-47's toughness gave pilots confidence. They began to fly lower, strike harder, and take risks others wouldn't dare. They trusted the jug to bring them home, and more often than not, it did. That confidence became contagious. When bomber crews saw P-47s overhead, they felt safer. One B-17 pilot famously said, "When you saw a Thunderbolt at your wing, you knew you'd make it home." Even after flak bursts tore through their wings, P-47s would often escort crippled bombers all the way back to England. Some landed at bases with engines barely turning, oil spewing from shot-out cylinders, propellers bent. Yet the pilots survived. There were also moments of eerie luck, like the story of Lieutenant Frank Euler. Over Germany, a shell hit his cockpit, shattering the canopy and knocking him unconscious. The Jug entered a dive, spiraling downward for several thousand feet. But the thick fuselage and aerodynamic balance kept it stable enough that when Euler regained consciousness, the plane was still flying. Dazed and bleeding, he managed to pull up and limp back across the channel. When he landed, ground crews found fragments of shrapnel embedded in the armor plate behind his seat, pieces that would have killed him instantly had the Jug not been built like a fortress. The nickname Jug originally came from its shape, short for juggernaut or milk jug, but as the war went on, it began to mean something else entirely. To the men who flew it, the Jug wasn't just a plane. It was a living, breathing guardian, a companion that absorbed fear and violence and somehow kept going. They trusted it with their lives, and the machine delivered. By the end of the war, thousands of Thunderbolts returned home bearing scars of battle. Some had hundreds of bullet holes. Others were so battered that they were retired immediately. But the sheer number of pilots who walked away from impossible situations became the stuff of legend. In the quiet years after the war, veterans would gather and share stories. Always the same tone, half laughter, half awe. One would say, "You think your Mustang was tough? Try flying a Jug with no oil pressure for 20 minutes. Another would nod and add, "She got me home on 2 cylinders. That old girl didn't know how to die." Even decades later, surviving P-47s that appear at air shows still bear the marks of their history: heavy rivets, thick armor plates, that unmistakable engine growl. They stand as reminders of a time when courage and engineering combined to create something nearly unbreakable. The Thunderbolt wasn't the fastest, nor the most graceful, nor the most famous fighter of World War II. But it was the toughest, the one that refused to fall. It brought men home when logic said they should have been gone. And in that, it earned something greater than respect. It earned love, the kind of devotion only a pilot can have for the machine that carried him through fire and brought him back alive. The P-47 wasn't just built to fight. It was built to survive. And in surviving, it made legends of the men who flew it. In the early days of 1943, the German Luftwaffe laughed. When intelligence reports first mentioned a new American fighter, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, German pilots scoffed. They called it the flying milk bottle, the bathtub with wings, and even a bomber pretending to be a fighter. It was massive, more than twice the weight of a Messerschmitt Bf 109, and nearly the size of a twin-engine aircraft. To the sleek, experienced German aces, it looked like an easy kill. They had ruled the skies of Europe since 1939, from Poland to France to the Russian front. To them, nothing could match the agility of their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. The Americans, they thought, were amateurs playing at air war. But then came the day when the laughter stopped. The first encounters. The first P-47s arrived in England in early 1943, flown by the 4th and 56th Fighter Groups. At first, even their own pilots doubted them. The Thunderbolt was huge, sluggish on takeoff, and drank fuel like a tank. Some pilots wondered if it would ever survive a real fight. Then came April 15, 1943, the first combat mission flown by P-47s over France. That day, the Luftwaffe learned something new. This fat American fighter could dive faster than anything they had ever seen. When a group of German FW-190s attacked from above, the Thunderbolts didn't try to turn or climb. They simply pushed their noses down and dived, reaching speeds over 500 miles per hour. The Germans followed, and their wings began to shake, then snap. The Jug could handle that kind of stress. The Focke-Wulfs could not. The P-47 pilots escaped unharmed, and a few German planes never made it home. It was the first of many surprises. The Thunder begins to roll. Within months, P-47 squadrons were sweeping deep into France and the Low Countries, escorting bombers and hunting enemy aircraft. Their 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns tore through anything that dared cross their path. A single burst could shred a Bf-109 or Fw-190 into pieces. German pilots began to notice that the Thunderbolt could absorb punishment like no other plane. Bullets that would rip apart a Spitfire or Mustang simply punched holes in the Jug's thick armor, leaving it still flying and still deadly. One Luftwaffe report described the Thunderbolt as a monster that refuses to die. By mid-1943, the kill ratios began to shift. The Luftwaffe's early superiority began to crumble as waves of Jugs escorted Allied bombers deeper into occupied Europe. The same pilots who once laughed now watched helplessly as their friends vanished in fireballs, torn apart by those 850s of thunder. Turning tide. As 1944 dawned, the Thunderbolt had become a symbol of relentless American power. The Luftwaffe, once feared across the continent, now found itself outnumbered, outgunned, and overwhelmed. German aces who once claimed dozens of victories now faced opponents who could dive faster, shoot farther, and survive hits that would destroy any German plane. Veteran ace Heinrich Oehler once said after an encounter, "The Thunderbolt dives like a stone and climbs like the devil himself. You cannot catch it and you cannot kill it." The Americans began using fighter sweeps, roaming patrols deep into enemy territory. Their mission: seek, engage, and destroy anything that moved. Rail yards, convoys, and supply lines became graveyards of twisted metal. P-47 strafed trains with gunfire so intense that engineers often abandoned their locomotives before the first pass. And in the air, the once dominant Fw-190s were no longer hunting, they were hiding. A new kind of fear. By the time of D-Day, the P-47 had become the most feared aircraft over Western Europe. It ruled the skies at low and medium altitudes, tearing apart German defenses in Normandy with rockets, bombs, and machine gun fire. Luftwaffe ground crews nicknamed it the Thunder Beast and prayed not to hear its roar overhead. In one battle, German tanks advancing toward the front were ambushed by a formation of P-47s. Within minutes, the column was nothing but smoke and flame. More than 20 vehicles destroyed by a handful of aircraft. A captured German officer later confessed, "When we heard that sound, the whistle and the thunder, we knew death was coming. You could not fight the Jug. You could only run or hide." That was the moment when the laughter, once so confident, turned to silence. From mockery to respect. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe's tone had changed completely. They no longer mocked the Thunderbolt. They feared it, respected it, and tried to avoid it at all costs. German pilots learned to recognize the Jug's silhouette instantly. The big round engine, the broad wings, the stubby tail. When they saw that shape, they often broke off and fled rather than engage. The Thunderbolt had earned a new nickname among them, Der Donnerkeil, the Thunderbolt. Even in propaganda, the Germans admitted its power. Reports warned that it was virtually immune to small-caliber fire and capable of destroying entire convoys with a single pass. The same pilots who had once joked about its size were now being hunted by it. The sky that once belonged to the Luftwaffe now belonged to the Jug. The silence of the skies. By early 1945, the German Air Force was a shadow of its former self. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, and relentless Allied pressure had broken its back. The Thunderbolt, once the underdog, was now everywhere. Strafing roads, destroying trains, blasting bunkers, and escorting bombers all the way to Berlin. German civilians looked up at the contrails and no longer saw their defenders. All they saw were waves of silver and blue jugs, roaring with that deep, angry growl of radial engines. When the war ended, the Luftwaffe had lost nearly 30,000 aircraft. A huge portion of those kills belonged to the Thunderbolt and its pilots, men who had once flown an aircraft no one believed in. The echo of laughter. In the post-war years, surviving German pilots often spoke about the Thunderbolt with a kind of awe. They admitted that it had changed the air war completely, not by being elegant or graceful, but by being unstoppable. One ace summarized it best. "We laughed when we first saw it, but the last time I saw one, I was bailing out of my burning plane. The jug didn't laugh. It just kept coming." That was the legacy of the Thunderbolt. The laughter that began in arrogance ended in respect and silence. The skies of Europe, once filled with the shrill whine of German fighters, now echoed with the steady rumble of American thunder. And when the smoke cleared, the world remembered that moment, the moment when the laughing stopped. The war ended long ago. The skies over Europe and the Pacific have long since grown quiet. But somewhere, every now and then, the sound returns, that deep rolling growl of a radial engine, echoing across the airfields of history. It's the sound of thunder, the sound of the P-47 Thunderbolt. And though the world has changed, that thunder never truly died. The last missions. When World War II ended in 1945, thousands of Thunderbolts were scattered across continents, lined up on airfields, parked in rows like sleeping giants. Some were scrapped for metal, their aluminum skins melted into the foundations of a new world. Others found second lives. They flew patrols in Latin America, guarded the skies over post-war Europe, and served as training aircraft for the next generation of pilots. But for many, their final mission was one of peace, to remind the world of the courage that once filled the skies. The men who had flown them went home, carrying memories carved into their hearts. Some became commercial pilots, others engineers, teachers, or farmers. Yet every time they heard the distant drone of an aircraft engine, their minds went back to that cockpit, to the smell of oil, the vibration of the stick, the heavy hum of the R-2800 roaring to life. They had survived because of that machine, and the bond never faded. Forgotten fields. For decades, the Thunderbolts sat forgotten, abandoned on tropical islands, left to rust in the jungles of the Philippines, or buried beneath the snow in Alaska. Their once proud fuselages became homes for birds and shadows. But not all of them were lost. In the 1970s, a new generation of aviators, collectors, restorers, and dreamers began searching for them. They dug through swamps, jungles, and old hangars, pulling pieces of history from the earth. Each bolt and panel they restored was a resurrection, a spark of thunder returning to the sky. One man, in Florida, spent 15 years rebuilding a single P-47 from the wreckage of 3 others. When it finally took off, the crowd fell silent. The air trembled. The same roar that once terrified the Luftwaffe now brought tears to the eyes of veterans who had not heard it in 40 years. It was as if time itself had rolled backward. The surviving jugs. Today, fewer than 30 P-47 Thunderbolts remain airworthy. Each one is priceless, a living artifact, a thunderstorm made of metal and memory. They appear at air shows from Duxford to Oshkosh, their massive engines shaking the ground as they lift into the blue. Pilots who fly them now describe the same sensations felt by their wartime predecessors. The heavy control stick, the deep vibration through the seat, the instant surge of power when the throttle opens. One modern pilot said, "You don't fly a jug. You wrestle it, respect it, and then it rewards you." At these shows, veterans, some in their 90s, stand quietly watching. When the P-47 passes overhead, many close their eyes. For a few seconds, they're back in 1944, flying over Normandy or the Ardennes, hearing the bullets ping off the wings, feeling the heat of battle. The sound brings them home again, the lineage of thunder. Though the Jug's pistons no longer fight wars, its spirit lives on. Its bloodline continued through the jet age in the F-84 Thunderjet, the F-105 Thunderchief, and finally the A-10 Thunderbolt II. Each new aircraft carried the same philosophy: protection, power, and precision. The A-10, with its titanium armor and massive cannon, was designed to survive where others could not, just like its ancestor. When the Air Force named it the Thunderbolt II, it wasn't just a tribute. It was an acknowledgement that the spirit of the old Jug, the indestructible, relentless warrior of World War II, was still alive. In the deserts of Iraq, the mountains of Afghanistan, and the skies over Kosovo, the sound of thunder returned once again. Not from pistons, but from jet turbines. Yet the meaning was the same: protection for those on the ground, and fear for those who stood against it. Remembering the men behind the machine. But the true thunder never came from the engines. It came from the men who flew them. They were young, barely out of high school, facing death at 20,000 feet. They flew through flak so thick it turned daylight into darkness, through clouds of smoke and tracer fire, trusting only the strength of their aircraft and their will to survive. Many never returned, but those who did carried with them an unshakable respect for the machine that brought them home. In interviews decades later, their voices still tremble when they speak of it. "It wasn't pretty," one said, "but when you were in a Jug, you were untouchable. It was your armor, your weapon, and your best friend." To them, the Thunderbolt wasn't just an airplane, it was a brother in arms. Thunder over time. Today, when a restored P-47 takes off, its engine coughs, growls, then settles into that deep rhythmic pulse. Thump, 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 like a heartbeat made of fire. The propeller blurs, the tail lifts, and it climbs into the sky, leaving a ribbon of sound behind. Children cover their ears. Veterans wipe their eyes. In that moment, the war returns not as violence, but as memory. A reminder of courage, sacrifice, and the will to overcome. Because the Thunderbolt is not just history. It's proof of what humanity can build when survival depends on strength, and when freedom depends on thunder. The immortal echo. More than 80 years have passed since the Jug first took flight, but its story continues. In museums, in the skies, and in the hearts of those who remember. Every time one starts its engine, the ground vibrates with echoes of another world, of dogfights over France, of smoke rising from rail yards, of pilots whispering prayers into oxygen masks. And somewhere in that deep rolling sound, you can still hear the laughter of victory and the silence of those who never made it home. The Thunderbolt story is more than history. It's a heartbeat that refuses to fade. Because true thunder never dies. It just waits for someone to bring it back to life.